Good day. Today we're examining what I believe may be the most consequential financial and political crisis to emerge in Europe since the creation of the Eurozone itself. And before I proceed with this analysis, let me remind you to tick the like button if you find this examination useful and wish to indicate that fact. The crisis I'm referring to centers on the European Union's increasingly desperate attempts to fund Ukraine's war effort through a scheme involving 140 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets. What has emerged over the past several weeks is not merely a disagreement about financial mechanisms, but rather a fundamental challenge to the very concept of European unity and, more importantly, to the basic principles of international law and state sovereignty that have governed the global financial system since the end of World War II. What makes this crisis particularly extraordinary is its timing, occurring precisely when Europe's own economic foundations are showing serious strain. The European Central Bank has been forced to maintain elevated interest rates despite recessionary pressures across multiple member states, while inflation continues to erode consumer purchasing power throughout the continent. Against this backdrop of economic vulnerability, the Commission's proposal to assume massive additional financial liabilities for Ukraine appears increasingly reckless. Now, to understand why this particular crisis matters so profoundly, we must first examine the extraordinary financial pressures that have driven European leaders to contemplate what can only be described as the legalized theft of sovereign assets. Ukraine's financing requirements have reached staggering proportions. According to the International Monetary Fund, Ukraine faces a financing gap of approximately $136.6 billion over the next 4 years. The Economist magazine recently estimated that Ukraine will require $360 billion over the next 2 years alone to maintain its defense capabilities. Here's where the story becomes particularly revealing about European decision-making processes. The European Commission, faced with these astronomical figures, has devised what they describe as an innovative financial mechanism. Approximately 300 billion euros in Russian sovereign assets have been frozen across Western institutions, with roughly 185 billion euros held at Euroclear, a Brussels-based securities depository now at the crisis epicenter. What makes this situation particularly fascinating from an analytical perspective is how it demonstrates the collision between geopolitical ambition and financial reality. The European Commission, under Ursula von der Leyen's leadership, has devised what they term an innovative solution to Ukraine's mounting financial crisis. The mechanism is complex, but I'll explain it in terms that make the underlying tensions clear. The legal framework underlying this enterprise is questionable. International lawyers point out that sovereign immunity, a cornerstone principle of international law, explicitly protects state assets from confiscation. Yet the Commission appears determined to proceed, arguing that Russia's actions justify suspending normal legal protections, reasoning that sets an extraordinarily dangerous precedent. Under the Commission's proposal, Euroclear would essentially be required to lend the entire value of the frozen Russian assets to the European Union. The EU would then loan these funds to Ukraine under extraordinary terms. Ukraine would only be required to repay the money after Russia compensates it for war damages. In other words, this is effectively a loan that may never be repaid, at least not by Ukraine. The technical complexity of this arrangement cannot be understated. It requires unprecedented cooperation between national banking regulators, central banks, and supranational institutions. More critically, it demands that European financial institutions assume legal and financial risks that have no historical precedent in peacetime international relations. The fact that such a mechanism is even being seriously considered reveals the desperate circumstances driving European policy. Now, here's where the analysis becomes truly intriguing and why Belgium's position deserves our closest attention. Belgian Prime Minister Bart De Wever has emerged as the primary obstacle to this scheme, and his reasoning reveals the profound legal and financial risks that European leaders seem willing to ignore in their determination to continue funding Ukraine. In his most recent letter to von der Leyen, dated November 27th, De Wever raised what I consider to be the most compelling argument against the entire enterprise. He argues that proceeding with this plan would effectively prevent reaching an eventual peace deal with Russia. His logic is straightforward. If Europe confiscates or restructures Russia's sovereign assets, these assets can no longer serve as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. Moreover, he predicts that in the very probable event Russia is ultimately not officially the losing party, it will be legitimately asking for its sovereign assets to be returned. This brings us to what I believe is the heart of the matter, something that European policymakers seem reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The entire scheme rests on the assumption that Russia will either be defeated militarily or will agree to pay hundreds of billions in reparations to Ukraine. But what if neither of these outcomes materializes? What if, as current battlefield developments suggest, Russia maintains its territorial gains and negotiates from a position of strength? Let me pause here to address the elephant in the room that makes this crisis so urgent. Ukraine's financial situation has deteriorated to an almost unmanageable degree. The country is burning through approximately $3 billion monthly just to maintain basic government functions. Without immediate international support, Ukraine faces the prospect of either defaulting on its obligations or hyperinflation. Belgium's objections, however, extend well beyond theoretical concerns about future peace negotiations. De Wever has identified 3 specific requirements that must be met before Belgium will agree to participate in the scheme. These requirements reveal the practical impossibilities that the Commission has been attempting to obscure. What's particularly interesting about Belgium's position is the domestic political context driving De Wever's stance. His new Flemish Alliance constituency is increasingly skeptical of unlimited financial commitments to foreign conflicts, and Belgian financial institutions worry about reputational risks from participating in asset confiscation. The political dynamics within Belgium add another layer of complexity. De Wever leads a coalition government that includes parties with fundamentally different views on European integration and foreign policy. His ability to maintain his current position depends partly on satisfying these diverse political constituencies, many of whom view the Russian asset scheme as an unacceptable expansion of European supranational authority at Belgium's expense. Furthermore, Belgian legal experts have warned that participating in the scheme could expose Belgium to decades of litigation in international courts. The country's Supreme Court has already indicated concerns about the constitutional implications of assuming unlimited liability for foreign sovereign debts without explicit parliamentary authorization, a process that could take months to complete and might ultimately fail. First, Belgium demands that all EU member states holding Russian assets participate proportionally in any liability sharing arrangement. This seems reasonable until you examine the details. Germany holds approximately 30 billion euros in frozen Russian funds, but German Chancellor Olaf Scholz faces enormous domestic political pressure not to assume unlimited liability for Ukraine's debts, particularly given Germany's own economic difficulties. The German situation is particularly complex because Scholz must navigate competing coalition pressures, with the Free Democratic Party opposing increased financial exposure, while the Greens support Ukraine funding without addressing legal risks. Second, Belgium requires that other countries holding Russian assets participate in the scheme. France holds approximately 19 billion euros in frozen Russian funds, Luxembourg about 10 billion euros, but both have remained conspicuously silent about joining the mechanism. This exposes the hypocrisy of demanding that Belgium take all the risks while other nations free ride. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Belgium wants binding guarantees that the arrangement won't collapse if one country decides to veto the renewal of sanctions on Russia. This is particularly relevant given Hungary's opposition to the scheme and the potential for other governments to change their positions as domestic political pressures mount. What makes this situation even more complex is the role of rating agencies and financial markets. Both S&P and Fitch have stated that the loan arrangement poses minimal risks to EU sovereign ratings, though for Belgium specifically, guaranteeing 140 billion euros would represent 22 to 23% of GDP, a massive exposure by any measure. Ukraine's financing needs are immediate. Without a resolution by early 2026, Ukraine could face a liquidity crisis, forcing it to choose between funding its military or maintaining basic government services. Here's where I think the analysis becomes particularly revealing about Europe's strategic predicament. The Commission has explored alternative funding mechanisms, including joint EU debt or bilateral loans from member states. But these alternatives would require immediate debt servicing costs and would place an even greater strain on national budgets that are already stretched to their limits. This explains von der Leyen's determination to push ahead with the Russian asset scheme despite Belgium's objections. From Brussels' perspective, there simply isn't a viable alternative that doesn't require European taxpayers to directly fund Ukraine's budget deficit. The political impossibility of this option in most European countries makes the Russian assets appear to be the only game in town. However, De Wever's latest argument about peace negotiations introduces an entirely new dimension to the crisis. He's essentially arguing that confiscating Russian assets would eliminate any incentive for Moscow to negotiate, thereby prolonging the conflict indefinitely. This perspective suggests that the short-term financial relief for Ukraine could come at the cost of long-term resolution of the crisis. The geopolitical implications of this deadlock extend well beyond Ukraine's immediate financing needs. What we are witnessing is the potential fracturing of European consensus on one of the most important foreign policy challenges of our time. If Belgium succeeds in blocking the mechanism, it will represent a fundamental challenge to the Commission's authority and could encourage other member states to resist Brussels on future initiatives. The ripple effects are already being felt in financial markets worldwide. Central banks in emerging economies have begun diversifying away from euros, concerned about potential asset confiscation. China has been watching with intense interest, reportedly discussing contingency plans for protecting assets in European institutions. The implications for global financial stability extend well beyond the immediate parties to this dispute. International banking executives have privately expressed concerns that the precedent being set could fundamentally alter the risk calculations governing cross-border capital flows. If major financial centers like Brussels can unilaterally restructure foreign sovereign assets for political purposes, it raises profound questions about the safety of international reserves held in Western institutions. This erosion of confidence is already manifesting in subtle but significant ways. Several major sovereign wealth funds have reportedly begun shifting portions of their European holdings to alternative jurisdictions, while central banks in Asia and the Middle East are reconsidering their euro reserve allocations. These trends, while gradual, represent a potentially irreversible shift away from Europe as a trusted destination for international capital. More significantly, the crisis reveals the inherent contradictions in Europe's approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. European leaders argue they are defending international law, yet the mechanism they propose, confiscating sovereign assets to fund military operations, represents a dramatic departure from established legal principles. The precedent this would set cannot be overstated. If Western nations can confiscate sovereign assets of countries whose policies they disapprove of, what prevents other nations from doing the same? As we look toward the new year, this crisis appears to be approaching a decisive moment. The Commission must either find a way to overcome Belgium's objections, devise an alternative funding mechanism, or acknowledge that Europe simply cannot sustain Ukraine's financial requirements at their current level. The broader implications for European integration cannot be ignored. This crisis represents the most serious challenge to European solidarity since the Greek debt crisis, involving fundamental questions about sovereignty and international law. What makes this situation particularly dangerous for European unity is that it exposes the fundamental contradiction between national sovereignty and supranational decision-making that has always lurked beneath the surface of European integration. If the Commission can force member states to assume unlimited financial liabilities against their will, it raises profound questions about the democratic legitimacy of European governance structures. The emerging alternative scenarios are equally problematic. Some officials suggest breaking the package into smaller tranches, but this would merely delay the fundamental reckoning about Europe's financial capacity. Other proposals involve creating new European debt instruments specifically for Ukraine funding, but these would require treaty changes that could take years to negotiate and implement, time that Ukraine simply doesn't have. Meanwhile, the broader geopolitical context continues to deteriorate. Military developments on the battlefield suggest that Europe's current strategy may be fundamentally flawed. Yet European leaders appear incapable of acknowledging this reality or adjusting their approach accordingly. The €140 billion crisis may thus represent not just a financial deadlock, but a broader intellectual and strategic bankruptcy that has profound implications for Europe's future role in global affairs. Each of these options carries profound implications for European unity and the future course of the conflict. If Belgium prevails, it may force a fundamental recalibration of European expectations about Ukraine's prospects. If the Commission succeeds in overriding Belgian objections, it may establish a precedent for financial coercion that could haunt European decision-making for years to come. The resolution of this crisis will likely determine not only Ukraine's immediate financial future, but the credibility of European institutions and their ability to function effectively in an increasingly multipolar world. We are witnessing a stress test of European unity that may prove to be as significant as any military development on the battlefield. This is where I conclude today's analysis. As always, you can find our programs on Locals, Rumble, and X. Remember to support our work through the links below, and most importantly, tick the like button if you found this examination useful. More analysis soon. Have a very good day.